I'm joined now by Eylon Levy, who is a spokesperson for the Israeli government. Thank you for making time this afternoon, Mr. Levy.
Thank you for having me on the show, Sangita.
May I start by asking you, how many hostages do you think Hamas still has?
At the moment, Israel has informed the families of over 120 hostages who are being held in captivity by both Hamas and Islamic Jihad. And it's important to understand who these hostages are. We're talking about, in many cases, children as less than 1 year old. We're talking about babies, only a few months old, snatched from their parents' arms, often their parents killed. We're talking about elderly people well over the age of 80 who are now suffering inside the Gaza Strip without medication, without basic facilities, obviously without any access to the Red Cross, because that's not a mercy that Hamas or Islamic Jihad have ever given to Israeli hostages. And Israel
we're going to
demands
get onto the
immediate
humanitarian
and
issues in
unconditional
a moment. How likely is it that you can bring those hostages back alive?
Israel is demanding the immediate and unconditional return of the hostages. And it's very important for us. You mentioned before the British government's position on the current crisis, which really the British government has been absolutely solid in its support for Israel. But it's really important for us that the international community raise its voice and make clear that this, one of the biggest hostage crises that certainly I can ever remember. It is absolutely unacceptable to raid a village, murder everyone you see, grab babies, run with them into the Gaza Strip and hold them in captivity. And the world must demand their immediate and unconditional release. That is our demand.
President Biden has said that the United States will stand shoulder to shoulder with Israel. At the same time, he has urged Israel to stay within international law. Is it?
Absolutely. Israel is responding forcefully to Hamas because its aim in this war is to destroy Hamas's military and governing capabilities inside the Gaza Strip in response to what was the world's worst terror attack in history after 9/11 just last week. President Biden said that happened to the United States. He would expect its response to be swift, overwhelming, and decisive. And that is exactly what Israel is doing. And on top of that, on top of taking this action to target Hamas specifically, Israel is taking steps to ensure that civilians are not hurt. That's the reason, for example, that Israel has been urging residents of northern Gaza to vacate south towards the southern Gaza Strip in order to get them out of harm's way. Because Israel doesn't want to hurt civilians. We do not want to see any more suffering. Honestly, everyone in Israel is emotionally exhausted after the atrocities that we saw last week. We don't want more suffering. We don't want civilians to get hurt. But in order for civilians not to get hurt, in order for us to be able to target Hamas's infrastructure, in order for us to be able to get to every single terrorist who was involved in the atrocious ISIS-style massacres that took place last week, we need civilians to get out of the way.
Well, I'd like to talk to you about that order to flee. I would hang on a minute.
Please.
This is an interview, and I'd like to put the questions to you
Please.
that my listeners want answered.
Please, I'm happy to hear.
On the issue of the order to flee, which is an order to 1.1 million Palestinians in the north of Gaza to move southward, and your original time frame was 24 hours. Jan Egeland, General Secretary of the Norwegian Refugee Council, and a man who, as you know, helped broker the Oslo peace accords, says the Israeli order for civilians to move from north to south is impossible and illegal. It amounts to forcible transfers and a war crime. That's right, isn't it?
No, absolutely not. And let me explain why. The United Nations cannot have its cake and eat it. It cannot say on the one hand that Israel
He is not
cannot
from the
target
United
Hamas.
Nations. He is not from the United Nations. He is from the Please let me ask the questions and correct you on factual matters. I have read to you a quote from Jan Egeland, who is General Secretary of the Norwegian Refugee Council. He is also a man who helped negotiate the Oslo peace accords. Would you react to the quote I put to you, please?
Thank you for that factual correction. I would refer to anyone making the claim that Israel should not be urging civilians to get out of the way temporarily for their safety, that they cannot have their cake and eat it. They cannot, on the one hand, say that Israel cannot target Hamas infrastructure because civilians might get hurt. and then at the same time tell it not to ask civilians temporarily to evacuate the combat zones because they might be displaced. The consequence of that is to tell Israel that it has no means to exercise its legitimate right to self-defense, a right that all the leaders of the free world have acknowledged, in fact saying Israel has a duty to do so. If they're telling Israel it cannot attack Hamas targets and it cannot ask people to get out of the way, it is telling us that in response to the worst terror attack in world history after 9/11, there is nothing Israel can do. And I'm afraid that's not an option.
Which creditable humanitarian organization has said that Israel does not have the right to self-defense?
Well, I'm explaining that that is
Has the UN
illogical.
said that? Because it hasn't.
Well,
nor
Sangita, I'm explaining.
have the Norwegian Refugee Council. So which credible international humanitarian organization, can you name it? Which is it?
No humanitarian organization has made that claim explicitly.
So
but
why
I'm
are you
this
saying
is
that they
because
have?
Because I'm saying this is the logical consequence of arguing that Israel cannot target
That is
Hamas
your
infrastructure.
opinion. That is not the logical consequence.
It is a logical consequence of saying that Israel cannot target the areas while civilians are there and that civilians cannot be asked to move. The only way that Israel can target Hamas terrorists without harming civilians is if they get out of harm's way. And that is what Israel is politely requesting they do, and move to safer areas in the southern Gaza Strip so that we can target the ISIS-like terrorists who perpetrated last week's massacre. We do not want civilians to get hurt. And in order for civilians not to get hurt, we're asking them to get out of harm's way. By the way, just like Israel has evacuated large parts of southern Israel, all the kibbutzim along the border, even the city of Sderot today, Israel is encouraging
The size of
residents to
Israel is in
evacuate.
no way comparable to the size of Gaza. Let me read this quote to you. This is Joseph Borrell, EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. Israel has the right to defend itself, he says, categorically. But it has to be done according to the right of international law and humanitarian law. Some decisions are against this international law. I put it to you again. He is right, is he not?
Israel does not want civilians to get hurt. In order for that to happen, we are asking them to get out of the way. We categorically reject the assertion that asking civilians to vacate a combat zone temporarily so that we can target the terrorists who have embedded themselves under their homes, under their hospitals, and under their schools is against international law. Israel has a legitimate right to defend itself, as the United Nations, as the European Union has made very clear. And in order for us to do that, we need civilians to get out of harm's way. And I would argue that what is impeding our efforts to minimize civilian casualties in the Gaza Strip is certain members of the international community telling the residents of Gaza that they should not be vacating. And tragically, we have evidence that Hamas...
Sorry, just to interrupt once more. I do apologise,
Please.
but I must jump in. Did you just
That's
say
all right.
humanitarian agencies are telling Gazans not to move? Is that what I just heard you say?
I'm saying that instead of urging them to comply with Israel's advice to clear out temporarily from the combat zones, they are saying that this is impossible and adding complications to our efforts to keep civilians out of harm's way. That in itself is something that is going to endanger civilians, in addition to Hamas's efforts to physically stop Palestinians from getting out of the safe zones. The Israeli army has released photographic evidence of roadblocks that Hamas has established to stop civilians getting out of harm's way. And we have evidence that Hamas has been stealing people's car keys as well in order to keep them in the combat zones so that they can martyr themselves for the cause. We are not Hamas. We do not share their same worship of death. We are a democratic country that wants life. We don't want more people to be hurt. That's why we are asking them to evacuate temporarily from the combat zones.
You are
so that
indeed
we
a
can
sovereign
do what we can
state.
do.
You are, in fact, the only democracy in the region. You are well respected by your allies. You are also signatories to the Geneva Convention and Article 3 of the Geneva Convention, which, as you know, states that no collective punishment should be meted out to civilians for the crimes of combatants. Yesterday, I spoke to another spokesperson from the Israeli side. That was the IDF spokesperson, Lieutenant Colonel Peter Lerner. He said that Israel, like you, had given the 1.1 million Gazans plenty of time to flee. He said that the routes were safe. This morning, there are verified accounts that at least 70 civilians have died as a result of bombing on the routes out of the north to the south, and a further 200 are injured. That does not sound safe at all, does it?
I'm glad you mentioned that incident, because we should all take with a pinch of salt any information coming out of the Hamas-controlled Gaza Strip, knowing that it is waging a war of misinformation against Israel. The allegation that Israel bombed that convoy has not been verified independently by anyone. Well, questions that have been raised by independent OSIT investigators who have slowed down the video of that explosion, they see absolutely no projectile falling from the sky and have raised the very serious prospect that it was in fact caused by the explosion of a gas canister. Now, it was irresponsible of the international media to run ahead alleging that this was Israel based on information coming from the Hamas-controlled Gaza Strip and this terrorist war of propaganda against Israel. Israel is not targeting civilians. It is asking civilians to get out of harm's way. Every such allegation is being investigated, and I would hope that the international media in the heat of war also wait to independently verify claims of atrocities, knowing that Hamas has an interest to make up atrocities in order to besmirch Israel and win sympathy among the international community.
I absolutely agree with you, and the report has come, is printed on the front page of the Observer newspaper, and it does not come from Hamas. It has been independently verified by two independent organisations. You mentioned the siege there, and I previously mentioned the Article 33 of the Geneva Convention. Let's turn to the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk. He says that the imposition of sieges that endanger the lives of civilians by depriving them of essential items, including food, water and medical supplies, breaks international humanitarian law. Your reaction?
The residents of the Gaza Strip are not going to starve, period.
Food is running out. That means they will starve.
But it is important, I assure you, they will not. Israel is working with international partners to create humanitarian. I cannot obviously comment on the details of sensitive, confidential diplomatic discussions.
Well, give us a timeline then. Time is running out.
I cannot give you a timeline,
Why
but
not?
I can tell you that Israel is working with international partners to establish humanitarian frameworks in the southern Gaza Strip that will help to ensure the safety of Palestinian civilians who heed Israel's advice to evacuate the combat zones to areas where it will be safer. And it is important to understand, I think, the reality that is taking place on the border, because I think some people don't understand that the entire area around the Gaza Strip is a war zone. People talk about
We
opening
absolutely
the
do
crossing.
understand it on this programme, I'm afraid, because we had a 20-minute interview, which is far longer than LBC normally does, with your colleague, as I say, from the IDF, talking about borders. The World Food Programme says that it has 2 weeks' worth of supplies for civilians, including medical supplies, waiting to enter via the Egyptian-Gazan border. Will you allow that aid in?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
The World Food Programme says that it has enough supplies to keep Gazans going for 2 weeks, and that they can bring those supplies in via the Egyptian-Gaza border. Is Israel willing to allow those supplies into Gaza?
Your question is whether supplies may be delivered through the Egyptian-Gaza border. I would suggest that is not an appropriate question to be asking an Israeli government spokesman. I do not control that border.
Well, they say that they are being stopped by Israel, who've sealed the borders. Therefore, it is an entirely appropriate question to ask you. And that, in fact, was reported by the BBC just 3 days ago. Unless, of course, you're going to say they're not verified journalists either.
I will answer. First of all, Israel does not control the border between Egypt and the Gaza Strip.
Israel
does control the border.
It has sealed the entrance, hasn't it?
Israel has not sealed the border between the Gaza Strip and Egypt because we do not control that border. That is a border between
Why did an Israeli
Republic of
spokesperson
Egypt.
say that to the BBC just 3 days ago then?
I'm not aware of this specific report. I can speak to the reality inside Israel, which is that the main crossing between the Gaza Strip and Egypt was between the Gaza Strip and Israel was almost entirely destroyed on Saturday when Hamas death squads invaded, massacred everyone in their path and blew it up. The only openings between the Gaza Strip and Israel at the moment are the holes in the fence that we're desperately trying to seal, and I wouldn't advise anyone to try to pass through those. We're talking about an area of active combat, rockets still falling falling on the area. Israeli forces trying to secure the scene to make sure that terrorists do not come out. The infrastructure does not exist on the ground for supplies to be delivered between Israel and the Gaza Strip, because we're talking about an ongoing conflict zone and areas that are constantly being under attack from the terrorists inside the Gaza Strip who perpetrated the massacre that we saw last week. As I said, the world's worst terror attack since 9/11, and that is a terrorist organization that Israel is determined to destroy inside the Gaza Strip while minimizing harm to civilian casualties by asking them to get out of the way temporarily
If the
until the fighting is
if
over.
the WHO can get supplies in via the Egyptian border with Gaza that you say you have no control over, would you ensure the safety of the humanitarian convoy?
As I would refer you to my answer to your previous question, Israel is currently working with international partners to create a humanitarian framework that will ensure the safety of people in the southern Gaza Strip who get out of the way from the fighting in the north. Beyond that, I cannot elaborate, saying that Israel is working with our international partners to create that framework.
Understood, Mr. Levy. Let's talk about the hospital. You've just referred again, haven't you, to the northern part of Gaza. You accept that you have ordered 1.1 million Gazans to flee southward. Inside that northern territory is Israel's biggest hospital. That includes babies that are in incubators, that includes the elderly, that includes people that need, that have just undergone operations, that includes people who are victims of, as Israel has described, the collateral damage done by targeting Hamas buildings. How do you expect any of those patients to flee northern Gaza and move south?
If I'm not mistaken, Sangita, are we talking about the same hospital in the Gaza Strip underneath which the Hamas terrorist organization has established its military headquarters? Are we talking about the same hospital?
I'm asking you a question. How do you expect the patients that I have just described to you to flee?
I think the question that should be asked is why the Hamas terrorist organization
That may
has
be the question
established...
you want asked. That is not the question I am asking you. How do you expect patients in Gaza's biggest hospital to flee?
Israel wants to target the Hamas terrorists who are responsible for the massacre last week. For that to happen, we need civilians to get out of the way. We understand that may be a very difficult task.
Do that,
we
Mr.
understand
Levy.
that we understand that may be a very difficult task. That's why Israel has identified routes along which people may evacuate. That is why Israel has given them more time beyond
What happens if they can't leave because they're sick?
I'm not going to speculate on what may or may not happen. What I'm saying now is that the people of Gaza, preferably with the encouragement of the international community, should do all that they can, make every human effort in order to evacuate the combat zone. Because Hamas has embedded itself deep inside civilian population, under the civilian infrastructure, inside homes, inside schools, inside hospitals. And in order for us to target Hamas, we would like as many civilians, as many as feasibly humanly possible, to get out of the way. Because, Sangita, we are honestly sick of the suffering, and we don't want to see any more images of suffering. And for that, I think we're taking a step that I don't recall any other country or any other army in the world taking in encouraging civilians to flee and giving so much warning before we proceed with our legitimate right of self-defense.
Does this warning that has just been issued in the last few seconds, does that mean that the IDF are about to start attacking civilian infrastructure in northern Gaza?
This warning is not new. Israel warned the people in the Gaza Strip 2 weeks ago, originally asked 24 hours to vacate from the northern Gaza Strip because the hostilities are going to come. We've given over 2 weeks because we take very seriously our obligations under international law to do everything we can to keep civilians out of harm's way.
Of course, the
now,
first
the
deadline was 24 hours. The first deadline was 24 hours.
24 hours. Yes, exactly. So this is repeating a warning that was given 2 weeks ago. So in order to give the people of Gaza ample time to move out of areas where there's going to be very heavy fighting because Hamas has embedded itself deep underpopulated areas. As part of this operation that Israel is going to move ahead with in response to the October 7th massacre, let's remember, it's only been 3 weeks since Hamas murdered 1,400 people in the worst terror attack since 9/11. Israel is going to go in to destroy the terror organization that committed this massacre. Now, what's the problem?
Sorry, just to be clear then,
deliberately...
the answer to the question was, are you reissuing the warning because the IDF, the Israel Defense Force, is about to target civilian infrastructure? Is that why the warning has just been issued in the last few seconds?
No, Israel is issuing this warning because we're going to target military infrastructure that is embedded underneath civilian infrastructure. We have a whole network of tunnels inside the Gaza city, for example, that Hamas has built underneath homes, under roads, under schools, under hospitals. Just yesterday, we released intelligence showing that Hamas's command bunker is in fact located underneath the Shifa hospital in Gaza. Hamas is using the fuel that it has stockpiled in order to ventilate its tunnels under the hospital instead of releasing it for the ventilators in the hospitals themselves. So we're targeting Hamas infrastructure. We have no interest in targeting civilian infrastructure. The problem is Hamas is deliberately using the people of the Gaza Strip as human shields. And so we're asking people to get out of the way. We've given them more than 2 weeks' notice, which is ample and I believe unprecedented in the history of international warfare as far as warnings go, so that we can target the terrorists who perpetrated the October 7th massacre while not hurting the civilians.
I should reiterate, Eylon, that the first flee northern Gaza warning gave 1.1 million people only 24 hours to evacuate. And then what we saw was international pressure brought upon the Israelis to extend that deadline. You mentioned there the Al-Shifa hospital. Last week I interviewed Dr. Ghassan Abu Sittar. He is a British-Palestinian doctor working with Médecins Sans Frontières. He is now working at the Al-Shifa hospital. He says that within the hospital's remit, within the area of the hospital, there are hundreds, if not thousands of people sheltering, that they are overwhelmed with casualties from Israeli bombing, as well as routine patients, so women giving birth, babies on incubators, elderly people needing care. What do you expect those people to do? They can't move, can they?
You know, it's only been a week since a Hamas rocket hit a hospital in Ashkelon in Israel. It hit the maternity ward. Thankfully, nobody was hurt because Israel had taken the move of moving all the incubators and the mothers, pregnant mothers, into the basement of the hospital as a precaution. Now, of course, that can't happen in Gaza because the basement of the Shifa hospital is used by Hamas as its command center. They're using the people of the Gaza Strip as human shields. We don't want to hurt them. Our war is against Hamas. Our war is against the terror organization that murdered 1,400 people, that beheaded, burned whole families alive, raped little girls so brutally it broke their bones, that tortured and mutilated people. Our war is not against the people of Gaza. That's why we're asking them to get out of the way so that we can target the ISIS plus terror organization that committed the October 7th massacre. We have no illusion that moving so many people is difficult.
Mr. Levy, what happens to the 400,000 civilians in northern Gaza, including those at the biggest hospital, the Al-Shifa, who cannot move? There is always in any population a group of people that cannot move because they are elderly, they're disabled, they are ill, they have nowhere else to go. What is going to happen to them is the question.
We are urging them to relocate south for their own safety.
They cannot relocate south, or they would have. So how will the IDF stay within the bounds of international law?
Sangita, the reason that people in the northern Gaza Strip haven't relocated south is that Hamas has physically set up roadblocks in order to stop them from leaving. Hamas wants to see civilian casualties inside the Gaza Strip because it wins propaganda points. And we're doing everything we can to protect our own civilians. By the way, Israel is full of IDPs, over 100,000 people who've been forced to leave their homes because they've been vacated away from the areas of danger. And we expect the same thing to happen in the Gaza Strip again, because we can't go back to 6 a.m. on October 7th. We can't go back to a world in which the jihadists of Hamas can invade us at will, abduct children from their beds, rape our girls, behead people, burn whole families alive in their homes. That will not happen. And that is why we know it's difficult. We know it's difficult. We know that the road ahead will be long and the road ahead will be hard. But we're doing everything we can, taking into account our obligations under international law, everything we can to urge civilians to get out of harm's way for their own safety, because this war must end with the defeat of Hamas.
You say that Israel is acting within the bounds of international law, and I'll be bringing my listeners an extended interview with one of 8 human rights and international law specialists, all of whom wrote an open letter to the Israeli government. And they begin their letter by saying, we write as Jews and we write also as experts, legal experts in the field. They include Lord Neuberger, who you will be aware is the former president of the UK Supreme Court, not a man who does not understand the law. They are very clear that what Israel is doing, with a combination of its siege, with a combination of bombing, and with a combination of asking 1.1 million people to flee, many of whom can't, they believe you are breaking international law, and you have put, as a result, Israel at risk of committing a war crime in the same way that the terror organization Hamas has.
No. I'm sorry, Sangita. On the morning of October 7th, Hamas death squads invaded Israel, seeking to murder as many people as possible. They took so barbaric weapons into family homes.
This is not a question of morality. It's a question of international law. This is not a moral relativism argument. It's about law.
Because I reject the moral equivalence you're trying to draw between.
I am not trying to draw a moral equivalence, Eylon. I have just read to you. I have just read to you an extract from a letter that you can get. We can send it to you, written by leading eminent lawyers in this country. I am not making the point, they are, and it is a point of law, not moral equivalence. Please answer the question about law.
I take that point. Needless to say, we firmly disagree with that assessment, as have many other international lawyers, and I will gladly lay out the case. On October 7th, the Israeli people were the victims of an unprovoked act of aggression, a war crime, a crime against humanity with the atrocious massacre. Now, that triggers our right and our duty under international law to defend our people. The proportionate response, that exercise of self-defense, is to totally disarm the enemy that committed that atrocity so that it can never do it again. And we are pursuing that legitimate objective by striking legitimate military targets and by doing everything that we can under international law to urge civilians to leave. It's important to remember that the rules of international law were not written in order to favor jihadi terrorist organizations against democratic sovereign states. We take our obligations very seriously. Many international lawyers, including members of the House of Lords, have spoken very forcefully about Israel's right to dismantle Hamas in response to the October 7th massacre, a point that, by the way, former President of the United States, Barack Obama, just hours after the initial massacre, said the whole world must stand by Israel's side as it works to dismantle Hamas. That is a legitimate military aim. Now, unfortunately, people are going to suffer. That is the nature of war. It's the nature of a war that Hamas declared on us that we didn't want, we didn't start, we didn't expect. Suffering happens in war. And we plan to end this war so that there will be no more suffering, so that we can get out of this cycle of violence by ending the terror organization, the jihadi organization on our borders, meters away from our homes, so that it can no longer drag us into this cycle.
We have just had a leading expert in military strategy on the programme, and he says that because of the nature of Gaza and the densely populated territory and the tunnels and the human shield, the use of human shields by Hamas, it is possible that by escalating your bombardment, escalating ground incursions, Israel puts at risk the safety of the hostages, the Israeli hostages, whose families desperately want them home alive.
I'm glad you're mentioning the hostages, because Israeli society at the moment is really sick with worry. We're a very small country, 10 million people. We have over 230 hostages. Everyone knows someone who has had someone close to them taken hostage, and we're talking about 230 people, including 33 children under the age of 18, 10 toddlers under the age of 5. And we are going to do everything we can to bring them home, because their abduction from their beds is a war crime. There are children whose parents were shot in front of them and abducted by a violent jihadist group that is holding them in a tunnel right now.
It is universally agreed. It is universally agreed that that is a war crime under international law. My question to you is the Israeli military strategy further endangering them? That's the question. And I know that you've given us a deadline with the time, which is why I'm rushing you.
We're demanding that their immediate and unconditional return. There have been 4 hostages who've been released so far.
But that was released through negotiation. That was released through negotiation.
Thanks to international pressure, not because Hamas suddenly decided to grow a humanitarian backbone. Thanks to pressure on Hamas and its supporters. And we're demanding more pressure be placed on Hamas and its supporters. And we know that if Israel were to step back, we would not see those hostages back. And I'll tell you how I know that. Because after the 2014 war, Hamas has been holding the bodies of 2 Israeli soldiers and 2 Israeli civilians, an Ethiopian Israeli called Avera Mengistu and a Bedouin Israeli, an Arab Muslim called Hisham Asayed, has been holding them hostage alive for all those years and has not given them back. So the prospect that Israel can stand back and negotiate for the hostages to be returned is not a realistic prospect.
Understood.
It's going to go after Hamas so it can no longer abduct our people again. That is an essential and legitimate goal of this war.
Understood. Your team did give us a deadline with time, so I'm just going to go over by just 1 minute because this is an important question that my listeners have raised many, many times, and I undoubtedly will raise again today. They claim that what Israel is doing in terms of asking 1.1 million people to flee south and then continuing to bomb Khan Yunis and the Rafah crossing is tantamount to ethnic cleansing.
Sangita, that's an outrageous accusation. Israel is going after Hamas terror infrastructure, and I'll speak to Khan Yunis. On Thursday night, I think it was, Israel launched an airstrike in Khan Yunis against a Hamas rocket launcher that was wedged between a mosque and a kindergarten. Now, under international law, nobody disputes that that is a legitimate military target. And in response to the October 7th massacre, by the way, since then, Hamas has fired 8,000 rockets at us. I had to run to a bomb shelter twice yesterday. It is entirely legitimate for Israel to take out that infrastructure. So we're asking people to leave the north because the north is where Hamas has most of its tunnels, and we're going to see the most intense fighting. But we've been clear this war is going to end with us destroying the whole of the Hamas infrastructure responsible for the October 7th massacre. Every tunnel, every rocket launcher, every Hamas commander, every single Hamas foot soldier, because this war cannot end with Hamas free to commit the atrocities it did on October 7th. It's not going to be like previous rounds.
You say this is targeted action.
We plan to win it.
You say this is targeted action and therefore is not ethnic cleansing. But over 7,000 Palestinians have now died in just 3 weeks. About 3,000 of those are children. That simply doesn't sound targeted.
Sangita, the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip as a result of Hamas declaring war on us is tragic. No one is disputing that. What we do dispute is the casualty figures presented by Hamas. The Gaza Health Ministry is Hamas. It's the jihadi organization that just a few weeks ago chopped people's heads off, raped little girls, burned whole families alive. So forgive us while we are a little bit skeptical about the numbers they're putting forward.
You may be numbers, but hang on a minute. Again, just a factual correction. Israel says that the Palestinian Health Ministry is run by Hamas. The health authority itself says that, in fact, the employees there are employees of Fatah, who run the West Bank. Fatah, the same group of Palestinian representatives who Israel says that it now wants to work with. My question to you is, 7,000 civilians have died in just 3 weeks. We have seen 1,400 Israelis killed in that terrible attack by Hamas that no one is condoning, certainly no one on this programme. Your actions cannot be viewed through the prism of being targeted enough, can they, according to a number of humanitarian organisations, including the NRC, who made that point on this show just a couple of minutes ago?
Sangita, in order to target the terror infrastructure inside the Gaza Strip, that can't be accomplished from the air. That's why Israel has called up the biggest ever mobilization of troops. Friends of mine who are now going to be in harm's way.
7,000 people, mostly civilians, have died in 3 weeks of bombing. The number is just going to increase.
And we hold Hamas, the jihadi organization that launched war against us with a campaign of beheadings, rape and burnings, to be entirely responsible for every civilian death, every tragic civilian death inside the Gaza Strip. There can be no equivalence drawn between Hamas, which hides behind its civilians to protect its military, and the Israeli people who are using their military to protect their civilians. We're doing everything we can to minimize civilian casualties.
I understand your point, Eylon. I understand your point, but just yesterday, the ambassador to the United Nations, the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations, said that the United Nations can no longer be taken seriously and was defunct. And that is being interpreted by some as Israel's position being that international law is no longer a requirement for your democratic nation state.
Sangita, yesterday the United Nations passed a resolution that astonishingly did not mention Hamas once, did not condemn its terror attacks and did not call for an immediate return of the hostages.
It condemned killing on both sides.
Now, 88 nations voted in favor of an amendment.
I've seen the text. It condemned killing on both sides. My question to you...
It did not mention Hamas, and it drew a mock... No, but please, I would like to respond to the point about the United Nations, because I think this is important. I don't think that a resolution passed by the likes of North Korea, Iran, and Russia has much moral authority.
It was 120 countries.
I remember that when Israel captured Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann, the United Nations condemned it. So when it comes to deciding how the Jewish people are going to deal with genocidal monsters who are openly vowing to murder every single one of us, the United Nations has no moral authority. We welcome the 88 nations that voted to firmly condemn Hamas' terror attack. We do not treat as a moral authority the likes of Russia, North Korea, and Iran deciding to call for a ceasefire.
No, it was not a ceasefire. It was a humanitarian truce. And I do have to let you go now because I've hit up against breaks and I've got in big red letters, Eylon, it says we need to break. But listen, just for the purposes of clarity for the audience, the UN resolution was for a humanitarian truce. It was passed by 120 countries, and the Israeli ambassador to the UN said that the United Nations no longer had any legitimacy or relevance. An IDF official says one of its soldiers saw the hostages emerging from a building without shirts on, holding a stick with white cloth on it. Nevertheless, all three were shot dead. I want to combine that with the news that we had a bit earlier in the week that elicited actually an international reaction, including one from our own Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak. You may have seen clips of an interview that is now doing the rounds. Sky News interviewed the Israeli ambassador to the UK, and during that interview, Zippy Hotovely ruled out categorically a two-state solution for Gaza and the occupied West Bank. Now, you will know that in the West, this has been very much mooted as a way in which to bring about long-term peace and security for Israel, and also peace, dignity and security for the Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip and on the West Bank. Sunak issued a statement saying that that wasn't reasonable, in essence. And Biden has, of course, encouraged the Israelis to make that part of its consideration. I'm pleased to say that Eylon Levy, spokesperson for the Israeli government, has agreed to come on to the show at quite short notice. So thank you very much indeed for doing that. You are, of course, spokesperson for the Israeli government. Let's turn first to that tragic news about the three hostages. Clearly, Hamas should not have kidnapped them in the first place. But of course, the Israeli mission has been twofold. One, to recover the hostages, and the second one, to, originally at least, to eliminate Hamas. Can you give us more details on how it is that the IDF killed those three young men in their 20s, please?
This really is an unspeakable and unbearable tragedy, and the whole of Israeli society is in a lot of shock and pain today. I can say last night at Shabbat dinner, when the news came through, no one could speak for 5 minutes because everyone was stunned into silence. The incident is under investigation. It's clear that a terrible, terrible mistake was made here. Our forces are operating in very difficult circumstances, fighting in urban areas where Hamas is fighting in civilian clothes, out of civilian buildings. There have been many cases where they have laid booby traps of dolls and played recordings of voices in Hebrew to try to lure our forces into ambushes. And it's clear that a terrible, awful mistake was made here, and it will be rigorously investigated. Lessons are being learned, and our thoughts and prayers are with their families. You know, I visited Kfar Aza just this week to see the ruins of the massacre. And in the youth village where two of them were abducted from, there were basically no survivors. Everyone was either abducted or murdered. And they put banners on the sides of the houses with the names of the people who were taken. And I was outside their houses this week, and it's very painful.
I actually saw that video that you did, that you've been posting, and it was terrible. And in a way, that makes this mistake all the worse. Yeah. I'd just like to read you the details from the IDF statement, because it raises some really important questions for the way in which the IDF have been operating in Gaza. And you yourself know, Mr. Levy, that the parents of the hostages and the family members of the hostages in Tel Aviv have been holding demonstrations because they are so horrified and so worried about their loved ones. So this from the statement from the IDF. The IDF has given more details. It says it mistakenly killed 3 hostages. An official says one of its soldiers saw the hostages emerging from a building without shirts on, holding a stick with a white cloth on it. The soldier felt threatened and opened fire, declaring that the men were terrorists, according to the IDF official. 2 hostages were killed immediately, and 1 was injured and ran back into the building. The soldiers heard a cry for help in Hebrew, and immediately the battalion commander issued a ceasefire order only for other soldiers to carry on shooting, and the 3rd man was killed. So just to zoom in on that, they came out with their shirts off, so it was to show that they were not booby-trapped, presumably. They were holding a stick with a white cloth on it, which internationally is assumed to mean that they are giving up. How on earth was that mistake made? They were clearly not a threat, were they?
No, that is the question that everyone in this country is asking. How on earth such an awful mistake could have been made? The IDF is investigating, we're learning lessons, and we repeat our demand that Hamas must release the remaining 129 hostages immediately and unconditionally. It must give them access to the Red Cross until it releases them. We're talking about elderly people without their medication, people who are abducted with life-threatening injuries, and every moment that Hamas holds them in a war zone, that Hamas embeds itself in civilian areas, in civilian buildings, trying to lure our forces into ambushes as we try to get the hostages out, is a war crime. And we're going to continue doing everything we can to get those hostages out. And our strategy at the moment is to continue putting unrelenting military pressure on Hamas to release them. That was how we got the previous hostage release pause. We had Hamas begging for a breather.
But that's not how you got the hostages out. That's not actually how you got the hostages out. Just to go back to the details of what is an appalling situation.
Sorry,
hang on. The building where these men had gone into had SOS marked on it. As I say, they were in civilian garb. They were stripped to the waist. They had a white flag. They didn't appear armed, and yet they were shot anyway. The logical conclusion of that, and I think we can both agree, can't we, that the shooting dead of those 3 men is breaking the rules of engagement. We can all agree that because the IDF have agreed to that. But it does lead me to wonder, in other cases, where the people that are being shot dead are not in fact Israeli hostages, but are in fact Palestinians, has it until now been IDF policy to shoot dead people who are clearly civilians, that are Palestinians, because they are Palestinians?
As you said, incidences like this are clearly violations of rules of engagement. Our forces have a very clear mission to distinguish between civilians and between combatants. Hamas tries to make that as difficult as possible.
Not in this case. Not in this case. The firefight was, this is the IDF saying this, the firefight was over, these 3 men were left behind. So just answer my question. Were they shot because the IDF thought that they were Palestinian civilians? Is that what happened?
The IDF is investigating the incident. I can't comment on it. This was clearly an awful, awful mistake.
Let's go back to the rest of the hostages then, because 110 plus have been released from Hamas hands and released back to their families and their friends and their loved ones in Israel. The vast majority of people that have been released got to that point because of negotiations. Because Israel and Hamas sat down together and negotiations that were brokered by the Qataris. Talking works, doesn't it? So why on earth did Israel remove its diplomats from Qatar?
Those negotiations were made possible because of the military pressure that had been placed on Hamas. Hamas did not abduct the hostages and say, let's start talking. Hamas had Hamas has a long record of holding hostages. We have hostages it's been holding since 2014. We haven't been able to get out. And what brought Hamas to the table, what brought it to a position where it was willing to release the women and children, was unrelenting military pressure.
Not according to the Qataris. The Qataris say that Hamas was open to negotiations before the ground invasion. That is on record. So I understand that that is your position, but as you know, that is disputed.
Well,
the IDF has only actually managed to regain one hostage through military action. That's correct, isn't it?
Sangita, the clearest evidence of the fact that we had Hamas begging for a breather was that part of the hostage release pause was that there would be a temporary cessation in fighting, because that is what Hamas wanted in exchange for releasing the hostages. We wanted hostages back. They wanted a temporary stop in the fighting because they were getting clobbered, and as a result, they agreed to a pause.
Brilliant. Why didn't it continue then? Because actually, you could have continued the humanitarian pause.
On December 1st.
You could have continued the humanitarian pause. You could have ensured a ceasefire, and you could have ensured that we didn't get to 20,000 dead in Gaza. You could have got more hostages out. Instead, we're at this awful scenario where on Saturday morning, 9 weeks into the bombardment, the total siege of Gaza and a ground invasion, the Israelis have just shot dead 3 Israeli hostages. This military strategy is not working, is it?
Sangita, let's correct the record because I think you have some of the chronology backwards. On December 1st, Hamas decided to violate the hostage release pause when it stopped releasing all the women and children it was obligated to do under that framework. And
Hamas says that you also violated it by shooting dead 2 Palestinians on a road.
No, Hamas violated the terms of the pause by not releasing all the women and children it was obligated to and then resuming rocket fire against Israel. Hamas started this war on October 7th and it restarted this war on December 1st. We said all throughout that hostage release pause, we would like to see that continue to get at least all the women and children out. And we had lined up enough violent offenders in our jails as part of that exchange to facilitate an extension of, I think, another 3 or 4 days. Hamas decided that it had enough of the pause in the fighting and it resumed hostilities by firing rockets at our cities and by not releasing all the women and children. And there are still 20 women and 2 children it has been holding hostage. As part of those 129 it refuses to release.
If it's working, why has it been rumoured by a number of experts who understand what's happening, and one that I spoke to off the record yesterday, who has just come back from Qatar? Why is it the case that it's said that Netanyahu is about to send back a negotiation team from Israel? It's because the military strategy is not working and you are losing public opinion, and you are also slowly but surely beginning to lose American backing.
Sangita, the military strategy is to place unrelenting military pressure on Hamas to bring it to a place where it wants to release the hostages. That strategy was vindicated last time, and we're continuing with military pressure because sending a nice email to Hamas and asking it nicely to release the hostages was never going to be work.
Are you going back to the negotiating table? Is Israel going back to the negotiating table?
I can't comment on sensitive details about negotiations, Sangita. Innocent lives hang in the balance.
In theory, this week, will we see Israel going back to the negotiating table?
In theory, we want to do everything possible to get our hostages out.
After 9 weeks of bombing, invasion and siege in Gaza, how many of Hamas's top leadership have you managed to either capture or kill?
We know we've killed half of their battalion commanders. We know we killed the commander of the Shaja'iyya battalion. And then when his deputy took over, we killed him. And now we've put his replacement on notice. We're going after in targeted door-to-door raids in intense urban fighting in urban areas where we have done our best to evacuate civilians. We spent over a month trying to get civilians out of those areas in northern Gaza so we can go after Hamas leaders. Unfortunately, many of them have now retreated to hiding in the tunnels they have built under civilian areas, trying to use the people above ground as human shields in total violation of humanitarian law and every norm of humanity. And we are going to continue going after all the monsters involved in the October 7th massacre, who've been threatening us with a repeat of the same massacre since the moment they retreated back into the Gaza Strip, with 250 hostages having brutally massacred 1,200 of our people.
Correct. Most of whom, in terms of the hostages, have been released through negotiation and ceasefire. On the first of December 2023, I made a note to myself. Diaf, Issa, and Sinwar. Issa, and Sinwar, who are the three of your top capture or kill list for Hamas, were not, in fact, captured or killed 2 weeks ago. We're now on the 16th of December. How many of those three have you actually captured or killed?
Sangita, it took 5 years for the Western coalition to get to Abu Bakr.
It's just a number. 1, 2, or 3.
No, the senior leaders are hiding in tunnels under civilian areas, and we have not apprehended them yet. But we're coming for them.
So just to be clear, 20,000 Gazans dead, according to the Palestinian Health Ministry, which you would like us to say is controlled by Hamas. 20,000 dead Gazans, around half of which are children, and you haven't managed to capture the three most important members of Hamas that you need to capture in order to meet your own military objectives. So how long is this war going to go on for exactly?
This war is going to end when it is safe for children to sleep in the beds in Kfar Aza, near Oz and Be'eri, in the communities that were brutally massacred on October 7th. This war will end when the diplomats at the United Nations who voted to keep Hamas on life support would feel safe taking responsibility to babysit children in those beds. That is our standard for ending the war. We call it the diplomat babysitter test. Because those Israeli communities that were brutally massacred on October 7th will not be a buffer zone against the Hamas terror regime. The Hamas terror regime will no longer be their neighbor when this war is over. And it's going to take as long as it has to take, not a day more, not a day less. And we think that our allies who want to bring this war towards a decisive end should stand firmly by our side as we use swift, overwhelming and decisive force as President
Mr. Levy, it's not
right
swift. It's very much overwhelming. This is clearly Israel is going to win this war. The question is, when do you decide to declare that it's over? President Biden has described Israel's actions as indiscriminate killing of civilians and has now urged Israel to move to a lower intensity battle. Are you going to do that anytime soon?
Sangita, if we'd wanted this war to end on October 8th, we could have. But when you take seriously the rules of proportionality and distinction and necessity as we do, when you carefully select targets, these things take time because, unfortunately, Hamas has spent the last 16 years embedding itself under schools, under homes, under hospitals as part of a deliberate strategy to attack our people and then hide behind their people. Obviously, we want this war to end. Sangita, we all want this to be over already.
But the question is at what cost? The question is at what cost? And may I ask, actually, let's move on. Let's just move on because I've been told that you've got to go. I've been told that you've got to go.
Well, you asked me a question. I'd like to answer it.
Go for it. What cost? We're now at 20,000 dead Gazans. We've already lost 1,200 Israelis. More than 7,000 children are dead in Gaza. The chances are you just turned Gaza into a massive recruitment ground, not for Hamas, but for the thing that comes after it, which is most likely to be a more extreme version of something that you're already calling a terror group. So when is this going to end? Because this is not a way to achieve safety for Israel, is it, Mr. Levy?
First of all, we're not sure what would be more radical or extreme than the army of terror that burned families alive, raped Israeli women and girls, tortured little children on October 7th. And we think that what would act as a fillip for extremism and radicalism is if the army of terror that did that were able to get away with it. And if it felt emboldened because well-meaning people around the world told Israel it has no right to defend itself.
Is President Biden wrong then?
At the end of this war.
Is President Biden wrong? Is President Biden wrong?
Biden has said from the very beginning of this war.
He says you're killing indiscriminately. Is he wrong?
He has said at every opportunity that the United States will stand shoulder to shoulder with us as we prosecute what is a common interest of ours to make sure that Hamas is destroyed in response to the October 7th massacre. And we've talked the Americans through every step in target selection process. We're learning from them. We're learning from you and the lessons of the campaign against ISIS in Syria and Iraq as we continue to go after the monsters who perpetrated the October 7th massacre.
But have you learnt the lessons of Afghanistan? Have you learnt the lessons of Afghanistan, where the Americans and allied forces went in with no plan? The Americans decided to wreak vengeance when the whole country was in grief. 20 years later, thousands and thousands of dead people, and the Taliban took control. And actually, this brings me on to my next question. I know you have to go. I'm sorry.
I answer that one first?
I'm sorry. Wait, it's all connected.
Okay, it's all connected.
So it's all connected because you will know that Israel's ambassador to the UK has categorically ruled out a two-state solution the day after, or working towards the two-state solution. So what is the plan for the Gaza Strip the day after Israel declares it has won this war?
So you asked two very different questions. I'll try to answer the first one first. Yes, we're learning the lessons from Afghanistan. That's why, by any metric, the civilian to combatant ratio is far lower than it was in Afghanistan.
Afghanistan was a 20-year war. This is a 9-week war.
The ratio, I'm talking about the ratio of civilian to combatants. When the fog of war clears, we'll explain very clearly.
That's been disputed and you know it. But anyway, let's talk about the next day.
I would be interested to see what figures you have about the civilian to combatant ratio in Afghanistan, but that's a different subject. Your question regarding the two-state solution. I can talk you through our thinking. The Prime Minister here has said that we think the Palestinians should have every right to govern themselves and none of the rights to threaten our people. Now, there was an illuminating poll that came out 2 days ago showing that about 85% of Palestinians in the West Bank think that it was correct of Hamas to launch the October 7th massacre, given everything that has happened in Gaza since.
So I'm glad you mentioned that polling, because I was looking at that very polling. Hang on a minute, you've just mentioned this polling. I looked at it last night, and I also talked to a couple of experts who understand the Gaza Strip very well. And you're right, that's a pretty respectable polling organisation. But that polling was done in the midst of a total siege of Gaza, whilst the Gazans have been bombed and they have been subject to a ground incursion over the last 9 weeks. Is it really surprising that they're saying that Hamas, under these circumstances, was right and that they do support them? Because at the moment, they've got nothing else, have they?
Well, I saw a similar poll right at the beginning of the war, before the ground offensive began, suggesting similar levels of support for Hamas's atrocities.
And I've seen the opposite.
I think it's particularly shocking that, given everything that has happened in Gaza since, a large majority of Palestinians think that it was the correct decision. Now, many Israelis will be asking, the Gaza Strip is a small territory tucked away in the corner of Israel, and the West Bank is a large mountain range a few miles away from Tel Aviv, that is 20 times the size of Gaza. And many Israelis will be asking whether our security could be assured if an independent state were formed in the mountains overlooking Tel Aviv, populated by people, 85% of whom think that the acts of burning, beheading, and rape on October 7th were justified, despite the cost that Gaza has faced since. But these are long-term questions, and there will be a time to discuss long-term questions. Right now, we still have missing persons and unidentifiable human remains in body bags.
I have to get to an ad break. Just yes or no, is it now official Israeli policy that a two-state solution will not be considered?
Official policy at the moment is we are focusing on prosecuting this war, destroying the October 7th monsters, and that is the top priority that this government is working on now.
So was the Israeli ambassador wrong, yes or no, when she said that you have ruled out a two-state solution? Was she wrong?
I'll tell you the Prime Minister's position. The Palestinians should have every right to govern themselves.
Was she wrong? It's a really simple question. Has the two-state solution been taken off the table?
Because these things are more complicated.
She was wrong then.